Maybe I'll even close it so you can't. But I'm going to turn the mic over, and we're going to plug your computer in. Got it. So Dr. Ramsdell is here. He's a clinical psychologist who teaches here at Mason undergraduate courses. He's also started the minor in forensic psychology. And there's also a concentration within the major, am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so if you're a psychology major, you can choose a concentration in several different areas, and one of the options is forensic psychology. There's also a minor, so if you have another major and you're interested in forensic psychology minor, we have that as well. So we're going to talk today all about what forensic psychology is, what it's not, and the kinds of super cool things that Dr. Ramsdell does with his job outside of Mason.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Just want to make sure. Yep, I'm Dr. Ramsdell. I've been teaching here at Mason for the last 7 years now, and started the forensic program here. When I'm here at Mason, I teach. I also do some pretty interesting research involving law enforcement officers and large-scale virtual reality. So, imagine a virtual reality room that's the size of this room that can hold 50 simultaneous wireless users. And we can make any kind of environment. And then we examine police officer use of force, police officer de-escalation. And I'm also working with Prince William County Police, and we're studying their crisis intervention team program and officer use of force and things like that. And then outside of Mason, when I'm not here, and I need to actually pay my rent, I work as an expert witness, right? And so in general, I consult with attorneys. Most of my cases involve police procedure, use of force, crisis de-escalation, but I also do interrogation and false confession cases. And sometimes I'll do jail, mental health treatment in secure facilities, that kind of stuff. But we'll talk about that as we go. So I'm just going to give everybody just a basic overview, because there's a lot of misconceptions about forensic psych and what a forensic psychologist spends their time doing. And it's not necessarily complicated, right, until you start examining it. So forensic psych is just applying anything that's psych to anything in the legal system, right? It's all it is the place where those two things meet. Right? Not surprisingly, courts have a lot of questions, right? They have questions, and especially about human behavior. And having a psychologist around can be really helpful in answering those questions. And I'll get into what some of those specific questions or the more common questions are. But it's really just the place where psychology and the legal system overlap. And by legal system, I mean criminal justice system in general. Now, psychologists do lots of different things. And all of those things can be done in the criminal justice system as well, right? So lots of professors here do research. The clinical faculty do research. Our doctoral students who are learning to be psychologists are doing treatment. They're doing assessments. But you can also do testimony. You can also train people. Lots of jobs for a psychologist, right? And then within psych, we got lots of different subfields. Here at Mason, at least, right? We've got clinical, we've got developmental, neuroscience, IO, and human factors, and applied cognition. So now, not all of those are doing work in forensics, somewhat obviously. In the legal system, it's big, it's complicated, it's slow, it can be frustrating. Right? But you've got jails, prisons. When I say secure mental hospitals, I'm not talking about a state mental hospital unless they have a forensic wing. I'm talking about a maximum security mental hospital, a place where people who are found not guilty by reason of insanity for violent crimes go. You've got criminal court, civil court, lots of police, sheriff. Community corrections includes parole, probation, that kind of stuff. And then the entire juvenile justice system. So a very, very big system, right, with lots and lots of people involved. Now, what's missing here when I put up psychology subfields is forensic psych. Like, is it technically considered a subfield? Yeah, but let me explain why it's not there, right? Now, if forensic psych is anything that happens in this area where psychology and the legal system overlap, then that's the kind of place where you may not necessarily live, right? You may just you may do one case, maybe you're a clinical psychologist and you treat people, and then somebody goes to court, you may have to testify, but then you're back to your clinical practice. Now, right? If a clinician is doing therapy most of the time, then they're just a clinical psychologist, right? That's their job. They've got a treatment practice. Some people come, they may have a specialty with like depression or anxiety or eating disorders or personality disorders, and they treat their patients, but then every once in a while, right, a client asks them to testify in court. Maybe there's a divorce hearing, maybe there's a child custody issue, right? And so if that same clinician testifies in a case for one of their clients, they're technically practicing forensic psych because they're in that space where psychology and the legal world meet. But that's not the place they live, right? That's not where they do most of their work. They're just kind of, it's like that just visiting space on the jail and Monopoly board, right? Now, if that's all, if this is the only space that you stay in, then then you can call yourself a forensic psychologist, right? If you never really leave that area, which is what I do, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a little bit. Now, right, most forensic psychologists are clinical psychologists. Like, are there neuroscience people or developmental people who may testify from time to time in court? Sure. But the vast majority, like if you want to be a forensic psychologist, the first thing you need to be is a clinical psychologist. Right? And there's two reasons for that, right? The first reason is most of the questions that the legal system has require like a clinical skill to answer, right? So these are some of like common questions that the legal system will ask. Criminal responsibility is like not guilty by reason of insanity. So not surprisingly, they're going to hire a psychologist to say like, did this person meet the legal definition of insanity? Insanity is a legal term. No psychologist is ever going to call someone insane, right? Did this individual meet the legal definition of insanity at the time of their crime? Because that's what they're saying. And they are going to ask you, and if you're going to do that, that's going to probably involve a diagnosis, like schizophrenia, right? It may involve a diagnosis like bipolar disorder or dementia. And if you're making a diagnosis, you need to be a clinical psychologist. That's how that works. Competency is the individual's ability to like, do you understand what you're being charged with? Or do you have the capacity to work with your attorney? Because if, you have to be there in court, right? Anytime your rights are going to be infringed upon as an individual in the United States, you have to be present so that you can object. But not only do you have to like physically be there, you have to be like there, right? You have to be like mentally there. And so that a competency evaluation is the most common type of forensic evaluation. Risk of violent recidivism is, let's say someone has been in prison for 12 years on a murder charge, and someone in the prison thinks that they are a candidate for early release. Not surprisingly, the parole or probation board is going to have some questions. Like, how likely is this person to kill somebody again if we let them out? Which is, first of all, not a fair question, because you're asking somebody to predict the future, which we just have like a bad track record as humans of doing, right? But they're going to bring in a psychologist to try and calculate like how likely is this person to commit another violent felony if we let them go, right? And what can we do to mitigate those risks? Personal injury evaluations would be if something traumatic happened, someone had their, I don't know, let's just say like you were working on a piece of machinery in an industrial setting and your arm got caught in the machine and it ripped part of your arm off, right? Then the court's going to have some questions like, obviously that's traumatic because you lost part of your arm. But like, does this person have PTSD? Because not everybody who experiences that is going to have PTSD. And if there is PTSD, how bad is it? How much treatment is it going to need? But again, That's a diagnosis, right? You need to be a clinical psychologist for that, right? And especially in child custody cases, which I do not do, mostly because all child custody cases are either one parent hiring you to tell you how awesome they are, or one parent hiring you to so you can tell them how horrible the other person is. And so I generally stay away from that. I don't have a lot of experience there. But again, you may be making diagnosis, substance abuse, some kind of drug abuse, maybe some kind of mental illness. So they require clinical skills to answer, right? And in order to answer questions that are clinical in nature, you need a license. Like, if you're going to sit down and evaluate someone, an inmate, anybody, like, you need to know what to do if that person tells you that they're suicidal. You need to be legally allowed to make a diagnosis. You need to be an expert in the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness, right? So you have to be a clinical psychologist first, which is why forensics is not necessarily up there in terms of subfields.